Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. In today's episode, if you're feeling strain of nonstop change, burnout, or anxiety on the job, you're not alone. And you don't have to check your baggage at the door anymore. Imagine a workplace that turns your toughest moments into fuel for growth, healing, and peak performance. Enter Susan Winchester, a former C suite powerhouse who rebuilt her life after a damaged past and now leads others to do the same. Blending wisdom with cutting edge research, Susan reveals how everyday stresses can become catalysts for resilience, connection, and lasting change. In this episode, we're gonna explore real stories that shatter the myth of grin and bear it. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, Susan.
Thank you, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here.
What inspired you to write Healing at Work, and how did your experiences shape the book's message?
Well, I will try to be brief because the story is quite long and probably not that interesting. But many, many years ago, back in the early 90s, my only sister passed away. And of course, that's a completely different story. But I want to share that that was really the beginning of my belief that I needed to capture that story. I detailed everything that happened that night. It was quite a horrific experience. I documented it literally the day after it happened. And I I truly believe that I was feeling called to write stories of my life. Not because my life's that interesting, but more about stories related to not only the passing of Nancy, but then also I just started writing down different stories that had happened to me that were challenging. Working in the corporate world for 36 plus years, I had some really had some tough moments, but I just started keeping track of these stories and feeling literally compelled that I needed to write down some of these things. Many, many years later, I was doing that. I was very gifted and I was very blessed to be gifted by Martha Finney, who became my co author. And she had read my first manuscript and said, all I want to know is how do you go from that childhood to that successful corporate career? And are you open to some new ways of framing things? And that led to another few years of work and research that created Healing at Work. And so it was a variety of different sort of weird situations, but a mentor who came in and said, I think you should write about the stories where you've had the most difficulty because the learnings that you had from those stories can be helpful to other people. And I'm very grateful for Martha Finney because the book would not be what it is without her influence. It was really, really powerful. So that's how the book came to be.
I love that. And I love that message in the book that healing is possible for everyone, and the workplace can be that powerful catalyst for transformation. So, building on that, you introduced a term called ASDP, Adult Survivor of a Damaged Past. Can you explain what this means and why it's so important to define this group?
Yeah. So as Martha and I were working together, we didn't really know what to call ourselves. So let me explain that. There's a groundbreaking study from the late 90s. The Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente did a survey. They asked 17,000 adults in the US to answer a question related to 10 adverse things that can happen to someone before the age of 18. And they were very surprised to get the feedback that nearly 67% of the people that took the survey indicated that they experienced at least one significant adversity before the age of 18. And actually, if you look at the data, 40% experienced two or more adversities, and we're talking big T trauma, really very serious situations. And Martha and I were both in that category. We were both people who, we were both in the category of more than four cases, which was kind of surprising. But we didn't really know what to call ourselves. So if you come from a dysfunctional childhood, how do you come up with a framing for that? And of course, there's the term ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, which is an amazing organization, which I attended for 5 years when I was living in Chicago. But that was very limited to growing up with somebody who had addiction to alcohol in the family. And what we were bringing into the discussion was how do we really help people understand that they're a part of a large group of us who did experience challenging childhoods And we wanted to acknowledge ASDP and really kind of break down each of those letters. So A stands for adult, which is just a reminder to all of us that we are adults and we have the power to show up in our highest functioning adult self at work. We often don't realize that we are not doing that. The S is for ASDP, S is survivor, which I love, is a very powerful word that even if you experienced challenging events when you were little, we can take those events and transform them, transmute them into great gifts and strengths. That's the S. The D is really recognizing damaged past, which encompasses damaged or dysfunctional experiences. But also, the D, I think, brings in the damaged beliefs that we carry about ourselves and the beliefs we believe about other people and how that all plays out at work. And then the ASDP, the P is the past, is recognizing that many of our beliefs were shaped early when we were little, and that we do have the power, though, to evolve those beliefs. And we do have the power that we don't have to bring those damaging beliefs into our day to day life. So these are things that were past. We often carry them heavy in our hearts, but we can learn to grow and just really evolve, taking all that into consideration. And so it's a very broad term that we think encompasses a lot of people.
Well, in defining this group, you're right, creates that sense of community and really and a starting point for healing, reframing survival as a strength and resilience rather than a shame. And it also helps individuals, I believe, realize that their struggles are common and it's not a personal failing, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. That's beautifully said.
So for those who might not realize how their past affects them, how do childhood wounds typically show up in workplace behaviors?
Well, I think the first thing to look at is what fuels our behaviors at work, which are very much shaped in our childhood, which are the beliefs we have about ourselves. And so, what many people didn't know about me until I wrote the book is that 30 of my 36 years' success were fueled by my limiting belief that I wasn't good enough. And I believed that it was my job to go into work every day, prove myself over and over and over again, wanting every single person that I worked with to feel like they were the only person that mattered to me, which fuels success because our organizations reward that, but it also fuels burnout, overwhelm, and exhaustion. So the first thing to look at, and I've had the privilege of being able to understand people's limiting beliefs because I've spoken to so many wildly successful people share with me that their belief is that one executive told me his dad said to him all the time, you can't do anything right. And so he was fueled by proving his dad wrong and took a job as basically an intelligence officer where what he did mattered because if he didn't do something right, he could have people could be killed. And limiting beliefs about feeling stupid, I'm stupid. And so part of what we start to see is that people are showing up at work unconsciously, the limiting beliefs are playing out everywhere. The need for validation from other people, the need to look good, all these different things are fueled by the limiting beliefs. And, so when we were little, those limiting beliefs helped us survive. They helped us create a sense of safety, predictability, and security. And our limiting beliefs were sort of the foundation, but then we would adopt these different patterns of behavior to help us create and manifest that safety. And so the other way this shows up at work, I think it mirrors the fight, flight, freeze, please response in the reptilian brain. So you see the pleasers, you see the workaholics showing up at work who are overworking to prove themselves. You see the bullies using anger, the fight mode. You see people showing up with behavior that seems over the top in terms of their intensity. So fight, flight, you see people leaving companies because they've concluded that, they're not good enough. The company doesn't value them. And then I have seen the behavior of freezing, are literally doing everything they can to stay off the radar. They don't want anybody to see them. I even worked with one very talented woman years ago who told me one day, Susan, I've been in this company 30 years and I have never spoken first before being spoken to. And so the way this shows up, all these experiences as an ASDP are through these unconscious beliefs about ourselves, how we think about others, and how we then respond. And how I felt about others is I believed that everybody else got to decide my worth and value. And my job, my strategy was to be as perfect and people pleasing as possible to get that approval. And so those are some of the clues that ASDPs experience when they're at the workplace. The other thing is, and again, I've had the privilege to work with executives and people at all levels. And the other, sort of consistent theme is that they feel run down. There's the feelings of pain that ensue as a result of never feeling like they're measuring up.
Well, I've seen that myself. Childhood wounds often manifest in perfectionism, fear of criticism, people pleasing, difficulty setting boundaries, and like what you mentioned, the signs of being on this unconscious wounded career path can include some of those reactions that you mentioned that are automatic, unexamined, such as overreacting to feedback or maybe avoiding conflict or feeling unworthy of success.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this in all the different organizations you've worked in as well, is that it's like this unspoken dynamic going on in our workplaces that we never talk about. And people are masking, I hear people talking about the imposter syndrome. They don't really feel like they belong where they are because of all this heaviness that they're bringing with them into the workplace.
Well, recognizing these patterns is just the first step. How can someone begin to shift from that unconscious wounded career path to what you call the conscious healing career path?
Yeah. So, the unconscious wounded career path, where unfortunately many of us spend way too much of our energy in, is characterized by the limiting beliefs, the unconscious patterns, literally driving everything that we're doing in the workplace, how we're defining ourselves and how we're showing up. And the other piece of it, to me, it's almost like I can see this spiral down where people are going in, they're carrying all this, heaviness around their beliefs about themselves. And it always feels, and this is how it felt for me, that I was spiraling down into this pit of pain and suffering, worry, anxiety, fear, judged, all these, I don't like to call them negative feelings because I think all feelings are instructive and informative. However, they're heavy and they're exhausting. And they're often reinforced through a person's rumination about what happened at work, what they did or they didn't do. There's this rumination dynamic that goes on as well. And so that's the unconscious wounded career path is a lack of understanding of how much the past is impacting our present and our future. And what we teach in the book is how do you step off that path and start to live a more joyful, a more fulfilling, a more fun career. That's what I call the conscious healing career path. And really, the first step is recognizing and becoming conscious to how much your beliefs about yourself, your interpretations of other people, and your response patterns are influencing your experience at work. And realizing that a lot of times when we're upset about something that's happened, we have created an entire story in our minds. We have unintentionally brought people into our story. It's like we've engaged them in they didn't realize they were being part of our story. And all of a sudden we have this spiraling down. And the conscious healing career path is starting to take ownership and accountability of things that are unconscious and becoming aware of how much is your limiting belief fueling your behavior. What strategies are you using? And are they enabling you to be successful without overwhelming or exhausting you? And realizing that a lot of times these moments, I know we're going to talk about this, but workplace conflict, what I call the bumper car moment when we crash into somebody or somebody's crashed into us, can be the catalyst for this unconscious wounded career path behavior. But in the moment, we actually can stop that pattern and start to realize, okay, how much of this is being guided from things from way long ago. It's teaching, and I do this in the keynote that I deliver as well as my course. How can people actually start to build strength and muscle around living in a conscious state rather than that unconscious state, which is the spiral down? For me, the conscious healing career path is like a spiraling up. Conflict's going to happen. We're going to get upset at work. Sometimes people call it being triggered by somebody at work. But rather than going into that sort of unconscious response, we can actually start to elevate our entire belief about ourselves and our entire experience when we step onto that conscious healing career path.
I love that, and I love your rapid power reclaim method as well, which encourages that pausing when triggered, creating space to choose a healthier response, and celebrating small progress. Because I think this attentional practice, repeated over time, really can help rewire those automatic reactions and build greater emotional resilience. And people need to be reminded that this process needs to be ongoing. And most importantly, I think for leaders today, it requires patience and self compassion, which I think is in short supply with many leaders.
I couldn't agree with you more, though. I mean, there's so much opportunity for a much more joyful experience at work. And it's such a natural reaction for people to blame the company, blame their boss, blame their coworkers. And, that when we do that, we're really sort of reinforcing that we're a victim. And we don't have to be a victim. There's a wonderful organization called Pathways to Successful Living. And one of the principles that's taught is this concept of victim, villain, martyr, leader. I see victim behavior all the time. Martyr, oh, I'll just do more. I'll just try to prove myself more. I'm an excellent martyr. Victim, villain, martyr. And the villain, we see villains in the workplace all the time. And sometimes we become the villain. And then the ultimate opportunity, which is the work that I know you care deeply about, is that we move people into leadership, accountable, conscious leadership. And that to me is the greatest opportunity for our organizations is how do we move as many people into that state of the conscious healing career path rather than that unconscious path, which can be really debilitating.
Well, a big part of your book is about reframing these workplace challenges. So, explain to us those bumper car moments, what they are, and how they can become opportunities for growth.
So the bumper car moments, Martha and I had the same concept in our minds before we ever met. And it was so funny when we talked about it when we were writing the book. But we both could feel that these moments at work when people get upset it's like you've crashed into one another. You think about the bumper car ride at the fair, you're riding along, everything's going well, laughing, and all of a sudden someone sneaks up behind you and crashes into your little car, and your whole body's like, what the heck just happened? And it's the same thing with workplace conflict. And sometimes we do something that actually initiates a bumper car moment we didn't expect because the other person has a super strong negative reaction to something we did or said or didn't do or didn't say. And then we can also do things where all of a sudden someone's reacting in a way that we were completely unprepared for. So it goes lots of different ways. And for me, the bumper car crash is that moment when we ideally bring our highest functioning adult selves into work every day. That doesn't happen. But we also bring our childhood realities with us. And the bumper car crash is when, you do or say something to me that really upsets me, when in fact my reaction is actually being fueled from those past experiences that I had when I was little. And I like the concept of the cover of the book because I know you've read it, are the two bumper cars facing off. And most people don't like conflict. They don't want to, they do everything they can to avoid it. And there's a great book called The Power of Discord by Dr. Ed Tronick and Dr. Claudia Gold, I believe are the authors' names. And in the book, they talk about how powerful conflict can be. And you talked about this early on in our discussion today in creating better connections, more, rich relationships. When we work through a conflict situation with someone productively and in our conscious healing career state, we can actually make stronger relationships happen rather than fractured and broken relationships, which is so often what we see.
That's a powerful reframe. You also emphasize the science of neuroplasticity. How can understanding the brain's adaptability empower someone to change these ingrained workplace behaviors?
First of all, this was some research that Martha and I did together on neuroplasticity and positive psychology, which we really bring together as a huge amplifier to people's capability to really change how we think. And, when I was stuck in my limiting beliefs, I wanted anything I could get to help me break out of those beliefs, to have more confidence in myself, more self acceptance of myself. And so the practice of positive psychology, or not positive psychology, but neuroplasticity, I'll bring in the other in a minute, is very powerful because basically the research shows that our brains are malleable. They're plastic, they can evolve, we can change them, we can change how we think and how we behave. What I love about that is that when you pair that up with positive psychology research, Dr. Seligman's work, the father of the positive psychology, the research really says that when we focus on positive things, we improve the quality of our lives. And we can actually reduce the degree of depression that's happening. And so, what Martha and I do is we pair those two bodies of research together to teach people that actually you can start to reframe, reset your beliefs about yourself through practice and reorganization. And in fact, I love this quote by a man named Dr. Bruce Lipton. He wrote a book called The Biology of Belief. And in it, he says that just having a new idea in our mind can change how we think and behave, which is exactly aligned with neuroplasticity. And so for me, the great opportunity here on the conscious healing career path is to start to reshape how we think about ourselves and rewire our beliefs about not just ourselves, but other people as well. And so I like to think of this as real hope that people don't have to stay on that same drudgery path of spiraling into those painful experiences of suffering.
I've seen that myself, that by practicing new thoughts and behaviors such as challenging negative self talk, celebrating achievements, or even responding differently to triggers, individuals can literally rewire their brains, empowering them to move beyond their old thought patterns, right? Creating a more positive, resilient mindset, which is really what's needed today, especially in leadership. So, what can managers do to support employees who may be ASDPs while respecting their privacy?
Yeah, that's a great and very important question. So first of all, I always make sure people know I'm not a trained therapist. That's not, I'm not my job as a leader is not go in and analyze people's childhoods, period. Our job as leaders is to coach our people to be as successful as possible in their performance and that the work that they're doing for the company. And ultimately our goal as leaders is that we want the best for our employee, we want the best for our teams, and we want the best for our companies. And so the approach that I take when I'm teaching people about, reframing and all these things is that, you don't get into the childhood, you focus on the moment that's happening, whatever is going on for this particular employee. So if an employee is having a very strong reaction to somebody else, they're very upset. Of course, this happens all the time. I talk to them about, okay, this is really interesting. You've just had a bumper car moment. You've crashed into this other person and now they're upset at you and you didn't even realize that you had crashed into them. And so how do we help them move beyond feeling like they're the only ones that ever experienced that? I always share the research. Look, 67% of us or nearly that have experienced some challenging experiences in our past. And so you're normal. You're totally normal. We all get upset. No matter how evolved you are, we all have moments of unconscious reaction to something that's happened. And our job then is to help coach them back into a productive state. And so I've got a short little cheat sheet here I wrote for one of my leadership tools. Is just a coaching method of how do you manage a situation where somebody's responding in a bumper car moment. Is as a leader just asking, tell me what happened. How is that making you feel right now? And a really important question is what are you taking it to mean about you? So we're all really good at taking it personally. I was on with a client this morning and she was upset about something happening. And it was really clear to me that she was having a very strong reaction that she was being disrespected, that this person was disrespecting her. That was her story. And I said, well, how do you know that? Well, because they're not doing this. And I said, well, but you don't really know. So what you're doing is making an assumption. And so it starts to just calm the person down that, maybe my assumption is not correct. And then really spending some time talking to them about, what are some specific things that can happen next? What would be the perfect solution? Is there a conversation you need to have with this person? How do I best support you? And so I'm always framing it in the context of the impact of them in the company the impact on their work, the impact on what's going on for them. But I come at it through the lens of being as good of a coach as possible, and then asking them what support they need from me to help them work through that.
I have found too that managers can foster this psychological safety by modeling vulnerability, right? Encouraging that open dialogue and providing resources for emotional well-being and most importantly, also just practicing active listening by showing empathy and celebrating each other's achievements so that they're helping to create that culture of support and encouragement that helps everyone to feel safer and take risks and grow.
Correct. Completely agree. And I completely believe that leaders who show up being real, that their words and actions are aligned to how they behave and how they interact with people. The willingness of a leader to admit they made a mistake or to admit that something didn't go the way they planned and that they took accountability for that. To me, the act of leadership vulnerability does do exactly what you said. It creates that psychological safety because if my leader is comfortable being who they are, then it helps me be more comfortable with who I am. And Brené Brown's done a ton of research on the power of vulnerability as well. And recognizing and confirming exactly what you just said is that leaders who demonstrate vulnerability create higher degrees of psychological safety within their teams, which ultimately fuels performance, which is what every organization is looking for.
Well, often though, progress feels slow in many cases. So, why is celebrating, which is probably the answer to that, is, we need to celebrate those small wins, right? And it's really important for us to do so to get that long term healing and confidence at work.
Yeah, well, and actually, I think celebrating goes even beyond that in terms of when I'm working with people and they've taken a different step, they've elevated their action in addressing something that has upset them. The follow on step is celebrate to integrate. And so when we start to rewire the neural pathways in our brains, when we've actually taken a different response than what our old response pattern was, it's really key that we spend time really embedding that in our everything, our soul, our body, our brain. And celebrating is a way of enabling us to do that. The celebrating actually begins to integrate those new ways of showing up, the new ways of believing, the new ways of responding rather than reacting, is the act of integrating those new behaviors into our identity. And so for me, the celebrating is the reinforcement of I'm taking steps on this conscious healing career path now, rather than staying stuck in that unconscious state. And I can give you one example just to bring this to life. And I'd love to know if you have any examples from your experience. But I was so programmed to people, particularly people in authority, their comments about things that I might be involved in doing. So I remember this happened years and years ago, but the leadership team I was on were in the middle of some strategy meetings. And my HR strategy session was going to be on Thursday morning. We started on Monday. And on Monday, one of the key leaders, the manager of this team, started making comments about, we don't really have a talent strategy. I, of course, took that personally. So I had a very normal reaction of feeling disapproved of, even though he wasn't even talking to me directly. And I never sought clarity about what do you mean by that? Because we had a strategy. But by Wednesday night, I had myself so worked up, so worried, so deep in that pit of pain that I was in tears. I could hardly function. We finished our slides at midnight that night, which I never do that. But I was so activated, so emotionally upset and afraid that maybe I wasn't enough for the role that I was in. And the next morning, before I went to prepare, ready to deliver our strategy, I did my own rapid power reclaim on myself. So step one is really, and you mentioned this earlier, is really pausing. I call it, creating choice, which is taking a deep breath and then finding ways to move that emotional energy out of my body. And there are lots of somatic practices to do that. Sound, movement, and breath is all that matters. So I did a lot with sound and movement, crying, upset, yelling, whatever. I got it out. The second step is, what am I going to do to elevate my action? And rather than going in there fearful, what can I do differently? And so what I did was I took a little pink post-it note and I wrote, this is the best HR strategy you've ever been a part of. And then number two, you have some of the best people working for you in your whole career. And number three, if this doesn't work out, I'm marketable. I just took that little post-it note and I put it on my notes for the presentation. And because I had like literally discharged the energy, I had my short little plan. I went into the meeting and we blew it away. The leader was high-fiving. It came from strength, groundedness in the conscious healing career path practices. And I remember thinking, all right, I got to celebrate this now. What can I do to celebrate? I didn't go into my fear mode and stay stuck there. And by the way, the old me in the past would have turned to alcohol to self soothe. That's the other symptom of people that are ASDPs in the workplace, is if you're using unhealthy self soothing habits like I did, it could be anything. It could be gambling, social media, porn. I used alcohol. We don't know how to regulate our nervous systems, but we numb ourselves out. And that would have been an old strategy of mine. And when I said, okay, what can I do to celebrate? I decided that I was going to go outside in nature and take like 10 minutes to just stand in nature and feel it. And I'll never forget the blue sky. It was as brilliant blue as you could imagine. The birds in the background, the gentle breeze on my face. And I'll never forget that moment. I get chills when I talk about it because I created choice, I elevated my action, and I took that moment to really appreciate me doing something differently rather than being the frightened little girl who wasn't enough, who was afraid of not being perfect. And it's embedded in my identity. And every time I've used that with myself or taught others how to use it, people start to get more comfortable. They start stepping onto that conscious healing career path even more than they did in the past. And that's the power of celebrating. It's an act of integrating it into those neural pathways that we were talking about. Have you had any experiences like that?
Quite a few. And I find, just like yourself, celebrating those small wins can really shift the focus from shortcomings to progress, counteracting that negativity bias that I think is common with so many of us. Just by even routinely acknowledging achievements, no matter how minor, builds my self-worth and resilience, because it's kind of a muscle that you have to kind of use and retrain your brain on, because there's those habits, right, that are so set within you throughout time, through those behaviors, those patterns that are no longer working for you, or you've had to use in your childhood to cope, to be able to feel love from others, that are no longer serving you. So it's so critical to make sure that you celebrate when you can shift that focus. And so many of us struggle with negative self-talk. Is there a simple question or technique? You kind of mentioned one, but is there another one that you find that is helpful to leaders and to everyone for interrupting that pattern in the moment? Because it really takes that self-awareness to stop, right? To become more deliberate and then to rethink or question your beliefs.
Yeah, well, the one question that I love, and if you read the book, you know this, is when you're getting upset, something's happened, is just ask yourself a very simple question. Am I sure? Am I sure my boss is really mad at me right now? Maybe he's got something else going on I don't even know about. Am I sure I got left out of that meeting because people didn't think I was smart enough? Or maybe they felt like it would be redundant if I showed up. I mean, it's a simple question. Am I sure? Because guess what? Us ASDPs have a habit of catastrophizing. uh, there's another great book, Dr. David Burns, the Feeling Good Handbook, and he's got the 10 distorted beliefs. And like I can check off many of them from my past, but the catastrophizing, we tend to think the worst possible thing. But that am I sure slows us down to say, am I sure Charles is really unhappy with me? I'm not sure. Maybe I should go have a conversation with them to see what's going on. Now, that's conscious healing behavior from a leader.
Love that. And I had another guest that is a expert in resilience, and he said, check your explanatory style. How are you explaining things? Is it something under your control or not under your control? Does it affect every area of your life or just a certain area? And is it permanent or is it temporary? just by taking that moment to pause and to question your beliefs in that moment can really help you put it in the proper perspective.
Wow, I love that. That's great context setting for those moments. Yes, that's great. I love it.
Well, for readers who may feel overwhelmed by the idea of healing at work, what is the first small step that you would recommend?
Well, I think the first small step I'd recommend is just to spend a little bit of time with oneself asking, am I okay living this career the way I'm living it? And am I open to considering this concept of bumper car moments being a catalyst to help me actually not only help me heal, but to help me have a much better work career experience? And if that's the case, if someone's willing to look at, I'm really tired of being in this unconscious state, this pit of pain and suffering, and I'd really like to do something differently. All I'm asking for people to be is to be open to the concept that workplace conflict could actually be your best friend. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's really powerful because those bumper car crashes are simply opportunities for us to help resolve these unhealed patterns that we have. We don't even know we're doing it. And so I think that's the first step, the first couple of steps. The other thing I would remind people, and sometimes this resonates and sometimes it doesn't. I was taught this by a great mentor, is to recognize that those most painful moments at work, those bumper car crashes, if we can start to look at them as these opportunities that have been perfectly designed for us as a part of the higher purpose soul journey that each one of us is on, and that as stressful and as upsetting as it may seem, this idea of starting to trust that these moments are simply happening to us to help us learn more about what is our ultimate soul vision. And I remember when my coach first told me this, I thought, I don't really like this. I'm not very happy right now. So how can this possibly be good for me? But coincidentally, since she and I had that conversation a few years ago, actually it's been several years ago, the more I read about the thought leaders, the people that are these brilliant, the Robin Sharma who wrote that wonderful book, the monk who sold his Ferrari. He talks about this and that these moments can be huge learning opportunities for us to release the grip of the unconscious healing career path. And so I think that really the key thing I'm saying here is for people just to be open to it. If you're open to it, there are tons of resources that can be leveraged to help you on this journey.
What even start by observing your reactions without judgment. Small moments of self awareness, like noticing when you feel triggered, can lay the groundwork for significant change.
I love that. That's really key because it's self-awareness. And I think that self-awareness and self-regulation are the two most important leadership requirements for the future. And you're right, just tracking a log of the bumper car crashes you're having and starting to look for patterns. What was my limiting belief that was playing out? What was my action? What was my outcome? And did that work or did it not work? And what can I do differently?
Well, on a broader scale, how can organizations integrate the principles of healing at work into their culture and policies?
Well, first off, I think a great starting point, because I've seen it happen and it works really well, is and a lot of organizations have done this, bring me in to do a keynote. And my favorite keynote topic, but it's easy to evolve, is when your past gets in the way of your future. Or it could be when your past gets in the way of your future, accelerating human potential or human performance. It's a very powerful message. It's proven. I've done it in many countries at many different groups. And it's a very impactful keynote that helps leaders understand dynamics and energy that's going on in their organizations that they never understood. It was just usually, why is that person acting that way? It's so frustrating. So that's the first step. Second step, I do a leaders workshop that has been successful with different organizations. And then I have my 12-week digital course where I teach anybody how to learn that process of moving off that unconscious path onto the conscious path. I've got a whole framework around how people can work through that. And then also through my executive coaching, I do a lot with healing at work. I bring it in as one of my frameworks for the work I do with executive coaching clients. And I have the privilege of working with some amazing organizations and universities and helping people to do that.
Well, let's return to the individual level. What role does self compassion play in the healing process? And how can someone cultivate it in a demanding work environment? I would argue a lot of leaders have this struggle with self compassion. They're too hard on themselves, especially in this current work environment.
Yeah, I'm an expert at lack of self acceptance, self compassion. So I want to kind of break the two things out: self acceptance and self compassion. To me, self acceptance is foundational, and I didn't have self acceptance for so many years. And to your point, spending all the time and energy beating myself up, no matter what was going on, whatever infraction I perceived myself to have done. And self acceptance is really about acknowledging all parts of ourselves, our past mistakes, our current day messiness. It's just saying that this is who I am and I accept it. And in fact, I discovered in the early 2000s that my purpose is to teach self acceptance to create a more joyful world, which is really the manifestation through healing at work and the work that I'm doing with my companies, the companies I work with. So that's really, really key, is that kind of breaking out self acceptance and what parts of us do we not accept and what do I need to do to change that. For me, self compassion is the act of kindness toward ourselves, is actually taking intentional steps that are designed to recognize that we are human. We're humans, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. I've heard it said. And that when our critic or inner critic starts to show up and telling us that we were stupid and we shouldn't have done whatever we did, it's really turning to that inner coach and recognizing that, okay, I need to be kind to myself. And what are some acts of self compassion that I can take that will have me feeling better? And, there's lots of different things here in terms of self compassion. One might be thinking about talking to yourself as if you were a good friend. We would never give ourselves feedback about how stupid we were. So it's really becoming. Actually, I love Mel Robbins got her book, The High Five. I can't remember the exact title, but she said, go into the mirror and high five yourself, even if you've done something that wasn't perfect. So I think self compassion and self acceptance really work together. And I tell you, this whole idea of celebrating and self compassion was so foreign to me. I had to start tracking in my iPhone notes, what are some actual things I can do? How can I be more compassionate to myself? What are ways I can celebrate? Because I didn't have a muscle around either one of those. And so I would ask people, I Google it, and so I had to start. That's how I started, was looking to my phone to say, okay, I need to celebrate. I have no idea what to do to celebrate.
I think you're not alone in that area. A lot of leaders don't have a very vast toolkit in regards to self compassion. For me, yeah, it's crucial for breaking those cycles of self criticism. And over time, it acts as a buffer against stress and really a foundation for authentic leadership.
Yeah, I agree. And it just feels better, when we're doing things, getting enough sleep. That was something I never did. And now it's a huge priority for me, is to get quality sleep. That's an act of self-compassion, is taking care of your body, totally changing how I eat. There's so many ways that we don't even think, but when you start putting your notes together, you can actually create a really powerful list of ways to be self-compassionate and self-accepting.
Well, let's talk about feedback because that can be especially triggering. How do you recommend handling workplace criticism or feedback when it brings up old wounds?
Oh yeah, well yeah, I can relate to this. We had a lot of perfectionists, high performing people working in our organizations, and if they've just done a 360 and 98% of it's fabulous, but 2% is not, they'll go into shutdown about the 2%. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody. So for me, feedback as a leader, what I always like to say is, when you're sitting down giving someone performance feedback, I have a very simple framework I use. I call it the suitability model. And it's based on some amazing research by some amazing people. I just modified it and made it more pragmatic for managers. And the model just basically says four things matter when you're having conversations. Performance is one, could be a selection decision, succession, whatever. And I'll do the four categories quickly. The first one is easy, is, what are the skills, knowledge, experience, and education required for this role? So if I'm giving someone feedback on skills, knowledge, experience, and education, that's how I frame the conversation. The second category I call capacity for complexity. And it really recognizes the fact that work varies in complexity and people's ability to navigate complexity also varies. And so it's really key that as leaders, we're thinking about, is the person capable to navigate the complexity or not? Sometimes the job's too big for someone, sometimes it's too small. But when you can frame it and you can define things through the lens of factors of complexity that you're performing well or areas that you're not performing well, that's one way to think about it, is through the lens of what are the elements of complexity that are either really working or not working. The third category, my personal favorite, is called temperament. And it's really our nature, how we show up every day. And we all have good days and bad days, and we all have strengths and weaknesses. And sometimes either our strengths and weaknesses or our negatives can actually become potential derailers. And so that's another category. And then the final category, and I'll come back to this in a minute in terms of how I'd answer the question, is called accepts role requirements. It's recognizing that every job has obligations and demands, and sometimes there's a disconnect between the person's willingness to take those things on. And so when I'm giving feedback, I typically will use that framework. And when I'm giving someone constructive feedback, I'll usually start out by saying, I'm curious, what's your view of how this is going? And so it's, first of all, it's really engaging with the other person to find out what they think. What's working? What's working for you right now in terms of the factors of complexity in your role? Are there any areas that aren't working? And then we just have a deeper conversation about that. And same thing with temperament. We all have pluses and minuses. Is there anything about your nature that you feel is really enabling you to be successful in this role? And talking about that. And are there any elements of your nature, your temperament, that are possibly getting in your way? And then we just have a conversation. So it's more of a curiosity discussion versus going in with a hard hammer to hit them on the head. The other thing, the temperament one often shows up in bumper car moments, by the way. The other thing that I often say, and I learned this again from a great mentor, is when coaching somebody, if they're doing something that's not working, I'll say, I'm afraid that you're doing something that's actually pushing away what you most want. In other words, they may be getting very intense in a situation because they think it's going to inspire people to go do something, when in fact the level of intensity is at such a level that it's actually working against them. And so I'll frame it sometimes in that way, which is, I see, are you open to hearing? I see something you're doing that's actually hurting what you most want. Would you like to know what that is? And generally people do want to know what that is. And often they don't even realize that they're actually doing something that's causing them to not get what they want. So those are a couple of techniques that I've seen to work pretty well.
How about for those who may not realize they're stuck? What are some red flags that indicate someone might be on that unconscious, wounded career path?
Yeah, so you spend a lot of time in the pit of pain. You find yourself ruminating. I used to name my workplace conflicts. I had IOD, which is issue of the day. So I'd go home and ruminate for a night. I had IOW, so I'd ruminate and stress and worry for a week. IOM, it was lasting for a month, or IOC, issue of a career, when I thought I was going to get fired. So that's the first thing, is are you finding yourself ruminating and worrying and stressing about things, and over what period of time? The longer this is affecting you, the more likely you are likely an ASDP. And then I mentioned before is that the other symptom, or I guess red flag, is starting to pay attention to how you take care of yourself when you're upset. If you're turning to habits that will numb you from being upset, and by the way, I'm really grateful to be sober now for 21 years. But if you're using something to numb out, that's another symptom. If you're just generally agitated and irritated with other people at work, or they're irritated and agitated with you, and you're getting feedback you don't like, that could be another red flag.
Also, with healing at work principles, you talk about a lot of different backgrounds. Now, does this apply to everyone regardless of their specific experiences, or is it really only directed toward those with certain experiences in their past?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And the answer is it applies to anybody. And so, first, if you are an ASDP, you grew up in a challenging childhood, you are a member of the club. You're an ASDP. Welcome. There are a lot of us. Then I've also had a number of people say to me after a keynote or different groups that I've worked with, Susan, I had a wonderful background. My family was loving and caring. And yet I still connect to everything you just described. And what I believe is a lot of people that had loving, nurturing, caring parents took away from their childhood that somehow they didn't measure up to the quality of their parents. I had one colleague who told me that he had a beautiful childhood. He had wonderful, loving parents. His father was a very successful psychiatrist. And the man told me that no matter what he ever did, he never personally felt like he measured up to his dad's success. And I've heard that story told through different ways from many different people. And then thirdly, the reason why I think healing at work concepts are relevant for everybody is that most of us are going into work every day, working with other people. And understanding the concepts of healing at work help us to become more aware of certain dynamics that are playing out, the bumper car crashes. Why is somebody behaving a certain way? It gives us a foundation upon which to be more successful in interacting with all the people we work with, whether it's a boss who seems unpleasable, someone who's just had a complete anger temper reaction. Understanding these concepts can help put context around what's going on.
I would agree. This message is inclusive and empowering for all. Let's move back to vulnerability because many leaders feel the pressure to appear strong at all times. What advice do you have for leaders who recognize their own ASDP patterns but fear vulnerability?
Honestly, I think it's great when leaders do their own work. That's the first thing. What people talk about, the inner work, and there's lots of resources to do that. It could be through therapy, it could be through a support group, it could be seeking an executive coach. That could be another avenue as well. I think that there's so many ways leaders can take accountability for their own healing. For me, that's the first step. You don't have to tell anybody you're doing this, but when leaders are doing their own work and are taking accountability and acknowledging that there are areas where they could be more effective, their teams will start to feel that even if they never discuss it. They'll feel the shift in energy, they'll feel the shift in accountability and clarity. You'll start to see signs when leaders are doing work that indicate that they are taking action to create a safer environment. But for me, leaders have to do that by being willing to do some of this work, which is not always easy to do, as you know.
Looking ahead, how do you see workplace culture evolving as hopefully more people embrace these ideas in healing at work?
Well, I'm very pleased to be part of what I think is a movement that's happening in the universe right now, where there are a lot of us. I was talking to a woman this morning who reached out through a common connection, who are realizing that when leaders are coming from a place of understanding the impact of trauma, either within their organizations or for themselves personally, it's a very powerful step towards creating healthier cultures for sure. Because what I've seen after working in so many organizations in so many industries in the US and outside the US is that when you have unconscious leadership behavior playing out, it creates a lot of disruption in the system. And so my belief is that the movement's going to get bigger and bigger. And I think the avenue in is we always have to be thinking about the purpose in working with organizations is to help them be more successful. This isn't about going in and doing therapy in an organization. This is about going in and finding ways to create levers for higher performance. And I feel very strongly that this work over time will start to create an expectation that leaders become self aware and self regulating. That's my belief. And I think that that will happen. I think it will take time. We got a lot of unconscious, wounded, healing career pathers out there. And I think that it will take time. But when leaders do that work, to your point, they start to create a sense of vulnerability that makes them more real, more open, and more safe for others.
Well, before we end today's conversation, what is that core message you hope leaders and listeners take away from your work, your research, and the healing at work principles?
Well, this is such a good question. You really got me thinking last week when you're asking these great questions. When I think about the key message for healing at work, and that really the heart of it is that your past doesn't have to dictate your future. It doesn't have to be the driver of your career and workplace experience. And recognizing that how you experienced your childhood, whether it was good or bad, definitely leaves different beliefs about ourselves that are really important to acknowledge, and that when we start to acknowledge and take accountability for those patterns, that's when we start to see real beauty unfold. And getting in touch with that inner critic and learning how to calm it so that we can create higher levels of self-acceptance and self-compassion. And I believe very strongly that it's not just good for individuals. This work is really good for organizations as well, because the concept from Sen Delaney, a wonderful culture organization, is that concept of the shadow of the leader. And whatever the leader is doing or not doing will cast a shadow through the whole organization. And I feel very strongly that healing work elevates the emotional intelligence of leaders, strengthens the company's culture, and ultimately leads to a better place to work and a better place for shareholders as well. And to recognize that, we don't have to stay stuck on the unconscious career path. It is completely a choice. We can change that starting today.
I love that core message that damaged is not doomed. No matter your past, you have the power to heal and create a fulfilling professional life, and the rest of your life is yours to shape. And the workplace can be a powerful catalyst for that transformation and joy. Thank you so much, Susan, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Sure. Probably the best way is Susan Winchester at susanwinchester.com. So susanwinchester.com, that's my main website. And then also on LinkedIn, you can find me, Susan J. Schmitt Winchester. Those are the two best places.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Susan. And thank all of you for joining me. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.